Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Claire's head spun violently, her vision blurring as she stumbled into the living room. The aftermath of last night's wild, whirlwind evening with Holden crashing down on her like an unstoppable wave. The champagne-soaked laughter, the teasing glances, the reckless abandon of passion that she had never thought she would allow herself, now leaving her body trembling and her mind in turmoil, every memory of their closeness replaying in her mind as if a film on fast-forward. The lingering scent of him on her clothes making her knees weak, and just as she tried to steady herself on the edge of the sofa, her stomach twisting painfully, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear, she felt her body betray her, the room tilting dangerously, her fingers clutching at nothing but air, the flash of her life with him, the danger, the secrets, the thrill, all colliding at once until she crumpled to the floor in a dizzying collapse, the world around her spinning in a nauseating blur as she tried to make sense of the chaos, and Holden, frantic and panicked, rushed to her side, his hands gripping her arms with a desperation she had never seen, his voice cutting through the fog in her mind as he called her name over and over, the fear in his eyes mirrored in her own, while she tried to form words, tried to reassure him, but the faintness refused to release her. The wild energy of the night before mingling with a sudden, terrifying vulnerability that left her helpless, her body refusing to obey, and the questions raced in her mind even as she struggled to catch her breath. Had last night been too much? Had she gone too far? And what about the consequences that seemed to loom over her like an invisible storm cloud, threatening to engulf her in a scandal she couldn't control? For even as Holden's hands were steadying her, his eyes searching hers with a mix of guilt and longing, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again, that their reckless connection had opened doors she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through, the implications gnawing at her, the whispered warnings in her head about what might come from a night spent with Holden, a night that had been filled with stolen kisses, dangerous touches, and promises neither of them were ready to admit to, the consequences now hitting her with the force of a freight train as her body continued to betray her, the faintness a physical manifestation of everything she had been trying to deny. The emotion she had buried deep now rising to the surface in a wave of panic and shame, while Holden, ever the protector, refused to let go, murmuring reassurances, but she could see the worry etched into his handsome features, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands trembled slightly as he held her close, the room spinning, her vision half-clouded, her pulse racing, and then the memory of every stolen moment from last night assaulted her like a series of flashes, each one reminding her of just how much she had allowed herself to let go, how dangerously close she had come to losing control, and what that could mean for her life, her relationships, her career. As she felt the faintest brush of consciousness slipping away again, the world around her a blur of colors and shapes, the sound of Holden's voice distant yet insistent, calling her name, begging her to stay with him, stay awake, stay present, but the dizziness was overpowering, her body shaking with the exertion and excitement of the night before, the alcohol, the adrenaline, the suppressed emotions finally finding a release in the form of this sudden collapse. While in the background, the city lights of Genoa City seemed to flicker and pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, as if the universe itself were mirroring the chaos within her, and Holden, refusing to leave her side for even a second, tried everything to ground her, pressed cool cloths to her forehead, whispered gently in her ear, begged her to breathe, to hold on, and in that vulnerable, terrifying moment, Claire realized that her feelings for Holden were far deeper and more complicated than she had ever allowed herself to acknowledge, that their connection was no longer just a thrill, a distraction, but something potent and all-consuming, something that carried consequences she was only beginning to understand, as the faintness lingered, a constant reminder of the night's intensity and the emotions she had unleashed. And even as she felt herself slowly returning to awareness, the room still tilting around her, her mind a swirl of fear, desire, regret, and anticipation, she knew that this was only the beginning, that Holden and she were now locked in a dangerous, passionate, unpredictable dance that could change everything in their lives. The wild night they had shared leaving not just physical exhaustion in its wake but emotional and psychological ramifications that would ripple through every interaction, every decision, every secret, every whispered confession from that point forward, and as she opened her eyes to meet Holden's worried gaze, she realized with a start that nothing could ever be the same again, that the consequences of last night would follow her, haunting her, thrilling her, terrifying her, A constant undercurrent in her life, shaping her choices, her relationships, her very sense of self, while Holden, seeing her consciousness return, let out a shaky sigh of relief, pulling her close, holding her as if letting go would somehow undo the bond they had forged in that wild, reckless, intoxicating night. And Claire, still weak, still dizzy, still overwhelmed, understood that fainting was not just a physical reaction, but a symbolic one, the collapse of her carefully constructed walls, the acknowledgement that her heart and body had been profoundly affected by Holden, and that moving forward, nothing would be simple, nothing would be safe, nothing would be predictable. And as she clung to him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her own, she realized that their lives had irrevocably intertwined, that the night's consequences were just beginning to unfold, that every choice from here on out would carry weight, tension, and drama worthy of Genoa City's most shocking headlines. And in that dizzy, fragile, electrifying moment, Claire understood with a clarity she had never known before that Holden was no longer just a man she had spent a night with, but a force in her life she could neither resist nor escape, and that the fainting spell, the rush of emotions, the wild passion, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it was merely the opening act in a story that would leave viewers of the young and the restless gasping, gossiping, and waiting breathlessly to see what the consequences of that one unforgettable night would truly bring. Even as Holden held her close, feeling the tremors that still ran through her body, Claire could sense the tension between them thickening like an invisible fog, the consequences of last night pressing down on her chest with a weight that made every breath a labor, her thoughts racing uncontrollably as the memory of each stolen moment, each reckless kiss, each whisper of desire replayed in her mind in dizzying, relentless loops, making her pulse race and her stomach churn. And yet, even amidst the fear and confusion, there was a part of her that could not deny the thrill, the undeniable attraction that pulsed between them, a magnetic force that seemed to pull her toward him even as reason screamed at her to step back, to retreat, to protect herself from the potential chaos that their night together could unleash, because Claire knew all too well the dangers of mixing passion with secrecy, of allowing her heart to lead when her mind had already sent warnings in flashing, urgent lights. And yet, as Holden's hands lingered on her shoulders, steadying, grounding, guiding, she could feel a warmth radiating through her that was both comforting and terrifying, the kind that made her want to surrender completely even as every fiber of her being whispered caution, while outside the safe cocoon of the apartment, the city seemed oblivious to the storm raging within her, the flashing lights of Genoa City's streets and neon signs echoing the chaos of her mind. And with every heartbeat, she felt the growing realization that nothing could ever be the same again, that their lives were now irrevocably tangled, and the consequences would ripple outward in ways she had not yet begun to comprehend. And as Holden looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of clarity, any hint that she might be okay, she could see the unspoken questions there, the worry, the guilt, the fear that maybe, just maybe, last night had gone too far, had crossed boundaries that could never be undone. And yet the undeniable desire, the spark between them, remained unextinguished, burning hotter than ever, and it terrified her as much as it thrilled her, because Claire knew that with every stolen glance, every touch, every whispered secret, they were stepping further and further into dangerous territory, where one misstep could unravel everything, where one revelation could destroy reputations, relationships, and hearts alike. And as she tried to sit upright, to regain some semblance of control over her body, the dizziness returned, sharper, more insistent, and Holden's hands tightened around her gently but firmly, anchoring her to reality even as her mind threatened to spin out of control, while thoughts of the night's wildness, the laughter, the dancing, the reckless abandon, pushed through her fear, mingling with memories of tenderness, of moments that had caught her completely off guard, leaving her questioning her own judgment, her own morality, her own heart. And in that dizzying mix of fear, desire, guilt, and longing, she realized that the fainting spell had been more than just physical weakness. It had been a signal, a warning, a revelation of the emotional storm that was brewing beneath the surface, an acknowledgement that her feelings for Holden were more complex, more dangerous, more consuming than she had ever allowed herself to admit, and that their connection, wild and intoxicating as it had been, was only the beginning of something far larger, far more consequential, something that could either lift her to unimaginable heights of happiness or plunge her into depths of regret and scandal that could shatter everything she thought she knew about her life, her choices, and herself. And as Holden's voice continued to call her name, coaxing her back to full awareness, his worry palpable, his touch unrelenting, She felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety, because while she was grateful for his presence, for the strength he provided in that moment, she also knew that his involvement in her life, their night together, had set in motion a series of events that neither of them could fully control, that the consequences were already beginning to take shape, invisible yet powerful, shaping their next moves, dictating the unspoken rules they now had to navigate. And as she clung to him, seeking both comfort and clarity, she wondered how they could possibly face the coming days, the questions from friends, family, and colleagues, the gossip that was sure to spread, the personal dilemmas that would arise, all stemming from the reckless yet undeniable passion of last night. And the thought made her head spin once more, the memory of last night's wildness intertwining with the fear of what was to come, the anticipation of confrontation with the truth, the possibility of heartbreak or worse, betrayal, all coiling inside her like a living thing, pulsating with life, demanding attention, demanding action, demanding reckoning. And as Holden pressed close, murmuring soft reassurances that barely pierced through the storm of thoughts and emotions inside her, she realized with a sudden, jarring clarity that the consequences were not just external, not just the judgment of others but internal as well, that she now had to face her own feelings, her own desires, her own vulnerabilities, her own fears, and that acknowledging them would be just as challenging as navigating the external fallout. And yet, in the midst of this emotional chaos, there was a strange, almost terrifying thrill, the awareness that she had crossed a threshold, that she had surrendered to something forbidden, intoxicating, and potentially transformative, and that even as fear and uncertainty clawed at her, part of her could not help but lean into the experience, into the connection, into the consequences, because they were real, raw, undeniable, and alive. And as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, as Holden's concern remained unwavering, as the room seemed to shrink around them, the implications of last night's wild passion became increasingly impossible to ignore. The faintness, the emotional upheaval, the physical reaction, all a testament to how deeply, irreversibly, they had impacted each other. And in that realization, Claire felt both panic and exhilaration, knowing that nothing could erase what had happened, that every decision from here on out would be informed by this shared experience, that every encounter, every glance, every word spoken in the coming days would carry the weight of their night together. And as she struggled to steady her breathing, to calm the spinning in her head, she knew that the road ahead would be fraught with tension, drama, and choices that could alter the trajectory of not only her life but Holden's, that they had opened a door that could never be closed, and that the consequences, both thrilling and terrifying, would continue to unfold with a momentum all their own, unstoppable, inexorable, and that she would have to navigate them with courage, wit, and emotional honesty, even as her body still quivered, still reacted, still reminded her that passion and consequence were forever intertwined, and that their wild night had set a chain reaction in motion, one that would affect not only them but everyone around them, leaving no relationship, no secret, no decision untouched. And as Holden's steady presence anchored her once more, she felt a mixture of fear, desire, and anticipation, the knowledge that their connection had irrevocably changed both of them, that the fainting spell had been a symbolic marker, a literal manifestation of the storm within, and that moving forward, they would be forced to confront the consequences of their choices, the desires they could not ignore, and the passions that refused to be contained. And as the night stretched on, the city lights casting shifting shadows across the walls, the faint hum of life beyond their apartment seeming distant and unreal, Claire knew that the coming days would test them in ways they could not yet imagine, that every encounter, every secret, every whispered conversation would carry echoes of that night, that the thrill, the danger, the intimacy they had shared would haunt them, drive them, and challenge them in ways both exhilarating and terrifying. And as Holden's hand remained on hers, firm and reassuring, she realized that she was not only facing the consequences of one wild night but of a connection that was deeper, more powerful, and far more dangerous than she had ever anticipated, and that acknowledging this truth, embracing it, navigating it, would define the next chapter of both of their lives, leaving them forever changed, bound together in a way that was as intoxicating as it was inevitable, and that even as the dizziness slowly faded, the emotional and psychological aftermath of their night together had only just begun, the repercussions spreading like ripples across the water, touching every aspect of their lives, every choice, every interaction, every secret yet to be revealed. And in that moment, as Claire clung to Holden, she understood with piercing clarity that the fainting spell had been more than a moment of weakness. It had been a turning point, a marker of the intensity of what had transpired, a prelude to the consequences, challenges, and passions that would define their intertwined fates in ways they could neither predict nor escape, and that the wild night, with all its reckless abandon, its pleasures and its dangers, had irrevocably changed the course of both their lives, leaving them suspended in a thrilling, terrifying, irresistible tension that would continue to unfold, ripple, and escalate in the days, weeks, and months to come, shaping their decisions, their hearts, and their destinies in ways that no one, not even Claire herself, could have imagined when the first sparks of that unforgettable night ignited, setting fire to everything she thought she knew about herself, about Holden, and about the future they now faced together, inextricably bound by desire, consequence, and a connection that refused to be denied, diminished, or undone. And yet, even as the immediate panic of her fainting subsided, Claire could feel an undercurrent of tension that refused to leave her, a gnawing, insistent awareness that the night's events had set something irreversibly into motion, a chain of consequences that no amount of careful thinking or cautious planning could undo, because the way Holden had looked at her, the intensity in his eyes, the subtle tremor in his hands as he had steadied her moments ago, had revealed a vulnerability she had never allowed herself to see in him before, a raw, exposed emotion that mirrored her own fear and desire, and in that reflection, Claire realized just how dangerous their connection truly was, how easy it would be to slip further into a web of passion, secrets, and potential scandal, and that even as her body began to recover, the psychological and emotional ramifications were just beginning to manifest, each heartbeat a reminder of last night's wild abandon, each breath a whisper of what had been surrendered, what had been risked, and what could never be taken back. And as she sat there, holding on to Holden as if he were the only solid thing left in the world, she felt a shiver run through her, not from cold, but from the realization that everything had changed, that the simple act of giving in to desire, even for one night, had the power to topple the carefully constructed order of her life, her relationships, her reputation, and perhaps even her own sense of self, and she could not ignore the storm building inside her, a swirl of guilt, longing, excitement, and fear that seemed to echo the chaos of Genoa city itself, where secrets, betrayals, and passions collided daily in ways that left no heart untouched and no life unchanged, and she knew, with a clarity that made her stomach twist, that they were now a part of that very storm, caught in its relentless, unpredictable currents, and that the fainting spell had been a symptom, a signal, a warning of just how far reaching the consequences could be, how deeply they had affected her, and how profoundly they could affect Holden as well, whose own eyes betrayed the conflict raging within him, the desire to comfort her clashing with the fear of what their night had unleashed, and as he brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, holding her gaze, she could feel the unspoken words hanging between them, the things neither of them dared to say out loud for fear of losing control, of unraveling everything, and yet the silence itself carried weight, as potent and dangerous as any confession, because in that quiet, pregnant pause, they both understood that they were no longer merely two people drawn to each other. They were two people whose lives, emotions, and choices were now irrevocably intertwined, bound by a night that had left them exposed, vulnerable, and acutely aware of the consequences waiting just beyond the horizon, and Claire could feel her pulse quicken again, not just from fear but from the memory of their closeness, the thrill of shared secrets, the taste of stolen kisses that had lingered like fire on her lips, and she realized that the fainting, the dizziness, the emotional upheaval, had all been magnified by the intensity of her feelings, the power of her desire, and the deep, almost frightening realization that Holden had become an inextricable part of her inner world, a presence she could neither ignore nor resist, and that this realization alone was enough to send her thoughts spiraling, imagining every possible outcome, every potential scandal, every whispered conversation that could follow, every confrontation with friends, family, and colleagues who might one day discover the truth, and she felt a shiver of anticipation mixed with dread, because she knew that the consequences of one wild night could unfold in countless unpredictable ways, some thrilling, some devastating, and that there was no turning back, no pretending that it had never happened, no erasing the fact that their connection was alive, electric, and undeniably dangerous, and as Holden's hands remained on her shoulders, firm and grounding, she felt a strange mixture of comfort and apprehension, knowing that while he was her anchor in this moment, he was also the source of a storm that could sweep through her life with relentless force, leaving everything changed in its wake, and as she struggled to compose herself, to steady her racing thoughts, she realized that the fainting had not been an isolated incident but rather a turning point, a pivot from which their lives would now spin in directions neither of them could fully anticipate, and that the emotional and psychological consequences were only just beginning to manifest, their effects rippling outward like invisible waves, touching every decision, every word, every action in ways both subtle and overt, and she could not ignore the thrill that ran alongside her fear, the undeniable awareness that this night, this moment, this connection, was unlike anything she had experienced before, a dangerous, intoxicating mix of desire, secrecy, and consequence that would challenge her. At every turn, and as she held Holden close, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her hand, she realized that the fainting had opened her eyes to truths she had long denied, truths about her own desires, her own fears, her own capacity for surrender, and that acknowledging these truths, facing them head-on, would be just as perilous as navigating the fallout in the outside world, because the inner consequences of vulnerability, of passion, of emotional exposure, could be just as devastating, just as life-altering as any external scandal, and she felt a rush of both terror and exhilaration at the thought, because she knew that the next steps they took, the choices they made, would define not only their relationship but the trajectory of their individual lives, shaping decisions, relationships, and reputations in ways that could never be undone. And even as she contemplated the gravity of the situation, she could not ignore the raw, undeniable pull that Holden exerted over her, a force that was both comforting and dangerous, thrilling and frightening, and as their eyes met again, she felt a flicker of understanding, a recognition that they were bound together by more than just desire. They were bound by consequences, by shared experiences, by the unspoken acknowledgement that one night had changed everything, and that from this point forward every interaction, every glance, every word spoken between them would carry the weight of that night, the memory of fainting, the echo of passion, and the ever-present, inescapable reminder of the consequences that awaited them. And as she leaned against him, feeling the tremors that still lingered in her body, she understood that their lives were now inextricably linked, their fates intertwined, and that navigating the aftermath would require courage, honesty, and a willingness to face the unknown, because the fainting had revealed more than physical weakness. It had revealed the depth of her emotions, the intensity of her desires, and the undeniable truth that Holden was no longer just a man she had shared a night with, but a force in her life whose impact would be felt in every heartbeat, every thought, and every decision to come. And she realized, with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and awe, that the consequences of last night were far from over, that they would continue to unfold, complex, unpredictable, and intoxicating, shaping their lives in ways she could neither ignore nor fully comprehend, and that embracing, understanding, and surviving these consequences would define not only the future of their relationship but the very core of who they were. And as Holden's voice broke through her swirling thoughts, soft, concerned, unwavering, urging her to rest, to breathe, to stay present, she knew that the fainting, the wild night, the emotional upheaval, were all part of a turning point, a beginning of a story that would test them, challenge them, and ultimately bind them together in ways that were as thrilling as they were terrifying. And in that moment, suspended between fear and desire, anticipation and dread, she understood that nothing, no secret, no memory, no fleeting moment of passion, would ever be simple again, that the wild night with Holden had consequences that would ripple through every facet of her life, and that embracing those consequences, surviving them, and finding a way to navigate the storm they had unleashed, would become the defining journey of her life, forever altering the path she had once thought so clear, so predictable, so safe, into one filled with passion, risk, revelation, and an intoxicating, undeniable connection that could neither be ignored nor undone. And that as she rested in Holden's arms, trembling, overwhelmed, exhilarated, she realized that the fainting had been both a literal and symbolic awakening, a reminder that desire, consequence, and emotion were forever entwined, and that their story was only just beginning, with every heartbeat, every breath, every glance carrying the weight and promise of what was to come, a thrilling, dangerous, irresistible narrative that would continue to unfold in the unpredictable, scandal-filled, passionate world of Genoa City, shaping not just Claire and Holden, but everyone caught in the wake of their choices, secrets, and undeniable connection.